Welcome. Thank you for coming. It is my pleasure and honor to introduce Dr. Gallimore. In order to not get too lost in his credentials and work, from his bio in the manual, it does say Dr. Gallimore is a computational neurobiologist, chemical pharmacologist, and writer. He's the author of articles and research papers on the science of psychedelic drugs, as drug actions, as well as 2 books, Alien Information Theory, Psychedelic Drug Technologies, and the Cosmic Game, and the recent reality switch technology, Psychedelics as Tools for the Discovery and Exploration of New Worlds. His current interests lie in the neuropharmacology and ontological implications of psychedelics, and how they might be developed as tools to communicate with alien technologies inaccessible in normal waking consciousness. Please extend a warm welcome to Dr. Gallimore.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Good morning. Again, I apologize it's so early, but I have to fly to Dallas immediately after this. So this is the longest of the 3 talks that I've given. Is anyone here not been to any of my talks at all? Okay. So you'll need to concentrate. So this is an intensive, so it's kind of going to be a little bit intense. I want to go into a lot more detail about DMT, about the mechanisms, what's really going on in the brain when you consume this astonishing molecule, and the mechanisms by which DMT might gate access, gate the flow of information from some other realm. That mysterious realm within which these even more mysterious beings are resident, the machine elves and their ilk. Fortunately for those that didn't make any of my earlier talks, I will do a little bit of kind of recapping for the benefit of those that either weren't at my previous talks or might have lost from their brains what I have spoke about over the last few days. So it's been a very busy and tiring few days. I have to be out of here at 10:45. I've got a man coming to take me to the airport. So I can't hang around at the very end and chat, unfortunately. But I will try to leave time for questions towards the end. And I think 2 3/4 hours around is a long time. So I'll probably have a little break, 5 minutes, bathroom break in the middle. I think that's reasonable for myself and for you. Okay, so again, for those that haven't seen me speak, please do visit my website, buildingalienworlds.com, where you can find out about everything that I do, my papers, my podcast interviews, and speaking engagements, and other things, my books. You can download sample chapters of both of my books, Reality Switch Technologies. So if what I'm talking about today interests you, then I recommend this book, Reality Switch Technologies, or my first book, Alien Information Theory, which is more metaphysical, speculative metaphysics on DMT and its relationship to our reality, as recommended by Paul Hynek. Thank you, sir. And also my Twitter. Do please follow me on Twitter if you're on there. Alien Insect. And if you want to subscribe to my Substack, where I post weekly or so articles on the neuroscience and neuropharmacology of psychedelics and other drugs, please do go to my Alien Insect on Drugs Substack. Okay, so just a brief outline what we're going to cover. I will try and take it relatively slowly. If I'm not making myself clear, don't hesitate to raise your hand and ask a question. I've tried to keep this kind of casual rather and a little bit more interactive if you like. So if you don't understand something, don't sit there in silence and suffer. But do just raise your hand and I will try and kind of go over again and explain again what I'm talking about. So I'll break it into 3 components, basically. I'll talk about information. My first book was called Alien Information Theory, for good reason. I think understanding psychedelics, particularly DMT, and understanding our reality in terms of information is fundamental, I think, to understanding how DMT can gate access to these strange domains, these hyperdimensional, bizarre, intricately complex and strange worlds. So I'll spend some time talking about information. So then we'll get on to the second part where I will discuss world building. So yesterday I spoke about this idea that your brain is a world builder. Your brain is a world building machine and uses neural information, neural activity to construct a model of the environment. And the world that you experience, as I explained today, and as I will go through again quite quickly this morning, the world that you experience is constructed by the brain. And I said yesterday that it was constructed from information, but I want to get into the weeds a bit more and talk a little bit more about what I mean by information and how you can construct a world using information. And also, that will lead us on to thinking about the structure of reality itself as being structured from information. So then finally, that will provide us with the foundation to think about how information can be transmitted, can be gated into the brain in the presence of DMT. So the transmission of information, the flow of information from this place that I have been referring to as other, this other place, the location of which we can say nothing about, but some other place. And it's this flow of information which your brain uses to guide the construction of this very much altered world model. Have I completely lost anyone already? Okay. So again, DMT. This is the molecule that we're all interested in. Well, I am. A powerful, short-acting psychedelic, very closely related to serotonin. We have serotonin on the left here. Again, if you're not familiar with chemical structures, it doesn't matter, but you can quite clearly see this relationship. The only difference between serotonin and DMT is that serotonin has this extra bit here. This is an oxygen, and also 2 groups, 2 carbons actually. These are called methyl groups, so this is why we get dimethyl, 2 methyl groups, dimethyl tryptamine. And this part of the molecule is called tryptamine. So serotonin is actually 5-hydroxytryptamine. So when DMT enters the brain and binds to these serotonin receptors, and again I will talk about exactly how this works, it causes a dramatic change in the structure of the experienced world, a dramatic change in the structure of this world model that your brain is always constructing. a shift from the normal waking world as a model of the environment that we're all, the old familiar waking world, to an altogether far, far stranger world that has no relationship whatsoever to the normal waking world. So it's this model, this reality channel switch, as Terence McKenna used to call it. As I've also said many times, and the reason that I'm particularly interested in DMT is because these effects are not easy to explain. They are truly, in my opinion, confounding effects. The brain evolved to construct a model of the world as a model of the environment. It took evolutionary epochs throughout your development and experience. From the moment you emerged screaming from the womb, your brain was honing its ability to construct this model of the environment. So the fact that when perturbed by this simple plant alkaloid, DMT, your brain suddenly becomes capable of constructing these bizarre, hyperdimensional, inordinately complex world filled with extremely strange, intelligent, powerful beings is not easy to explain. Unless DMT is indeed granting access to some other domain. If indeed DMT does gate the flow of information from this other domain into your brain, acting as an alternate source of sensory information. So again, I don't think I need to talk too much about this. I've been through it a couple of times, but just to remind everyone, these are the characteristic qualities of DMT. What Graham succinctly describes as a highly artificial, constructed, inorganic, and in essence technological environment. A very strange place indeed. And again, when people consume DMT, they consistently report the same types of environments with the same qualities, the same types of extremely advanced beings, machine-like beings, high alien technology, insect-like intelligences come up again and again. Hyper-technological space, very intelligent. More insects. They have an agenda. It's like walking into a different neighborhood. You're not really sure what the culture is. You are, indeed, you seem to be entering a truly alien environment, an alien world, filled with advanced alien intelligences. There were beings that seemed to inhabit this place, that seemed to come off as vastly more intelligent and vastly more capable. I take seriously the idea that we are indeed interacting with advanced alien intelligences with this molecular technology, DMT. Okay, so brief review. Your brain, this world building machine that we all carry around in our heads, responsible for constructing your subjective world as a model of the environment. The cortex, the outer layer of the brain, this is the part of the brain responsible for constructing this world model. A thin, just a few millimeters thick, a thin sheet of neurons that surrounds the brain, or surrounds the outer layer of the brain, also referred to as the gray matter. This is where your world-building machinery is located. If you look at the cortex under a microscope at a very small scale, you'll see it is constructed from these column-like structures that are referred to as What are they called? Cortical columns. That was a question. Yeah, I will throw out some questions. I know some of you were here yesterday, so I'm testing you. These are obviously, this is not the actual color, but yes, these are actually the different layers. So you can identify 6 and perhaps even more sub-layers as well. 6 layers of the cortex. In each of these layers, the different colors represents different types of cells. So they form this layered structure. Does that answer your question? Oh, no. There's nothing. It's just to identify. There's nothing. It's not yellow. This isn't yellow for a reason. It's just yellow because they chose yellow. Yeah. So don't worry about the actual details of the colors there. No. Okay. So we have these cortical columns. You can see each column is built from loads of these interconnected brain cells, neurons. These are the information-generating cells. So that each cortical column forms this basic computational unit of the cortex. And there are millions and millions of these, all stacked together. I guess kind of like this, yes, like this, stacked together side by side like a kind of mosaic. So a little bit clearer. Here we can also see the layers of the cortical columns and the bird's eye view. This is what you will see throughout this talk. These line of columns from above. So again, another representation. We have the brain from above, the cortex from above. You have different lobes of the cortex, with the frontal lobe, the temporal lobes, the parietal lobe, and the occipital lobe. Very good. We also have this small area, this little cerebellum. But anyway, don't worry about the names of the lobes, not important, but this is the cortex. And if you take a little patch of cortex here, you can see that it's built from this mosaic of columns. And somewhat oversimplifying the case, we can imagine that a single cortical column can either be in an active state or an inactive state, on or off. So in this case, we've got these blue shaded columns are active and the gray ones are inactive. So if this is your cortical column structure, this mosaic of columns, then the active and inactive columns, they form a kind of pattern. They form a kind of pattern. A pattern of column activation. And as will become clear, hopefully, this pattern of column activation changes over time. Your entire world at any moment in time, the structure, the content, the dynamics, everything that you are experiencing as a world is represented by a pattern of cortical column activation. That's difficult to believe, but it's true. So this pattern of cortical column activation, or should I say the subjective world that you experience, is what this pattern of cortical column activation feels like from your subjective perspective. We don't really understand why there should be a subjective perspective to all of this, but that gets into issues of consciousness and qualia, which I won't get into. So I'm not reducing consciousness to this pattern of column activity. All I'm saying is that the structure, the informational structure, the content, the dynamics of your experienced world is this pattern of cortical column activation. And because your world is changing moment by moment, you never experience the same moment twice. You know that old saying, you never step into the same river twice. You never experience the same world twice. Every moment your world changes. Every moment this pattern of cortical column activity changes to a state it has never before reached and will never reach again. So again, to make it more clear, as I showed yesterday, let's take a visual object, perceived visual object, this little alien face. Imagine it's moving. So it has a number of visual features that we can identify. We can see there are circles. We can see that there are colors. There is a certain texture to it. There is movement. These are all different visual features, and they're all represented by specific groups of cortical columns that are responsible for representing those particular features of your experienced world. So we have columns that are specialized to represent motion information, columns to represent color, columns for form, so shapes, objects, columns for texture, etc. This is obviously massively oversimplifying it. And so we can form the cortical representation of this perceived object using a pattern of cortical column activation. So we can see we have certain columns that are active in each of the specialized groups of columns, and these columns are connected to each other. So it forms this unified pattern of cortical column activation. That unified pattern of column activation represents the informational structure of the perceived visual object. Or to put it another way, this perceived visual object is what this pattern of cortical column activation feels like from your subjective perspective. So yesterday, I asked the question, well, if your entire world is this pattern of cortical column activation, we have millions of these columns. So how many different possible patterns of cortical column activation are there? How many different worlds, world moments, if you like, can your brain actually construct? It's a very, very large number, 2 to the power of the number of cortical columns, which is a number so incomprehensively vast that it's practically infinite. This is why your brain can construct this rich, informationally rich world. If you look around you and try to imagine how long it would take to describe every feature of your world, all the colors, all the shapes, all the objects, all the relationships between them, in sufficient detail such that a skilled artist could reproduce your visual world with photographic precision. Just think about the amount of information in your world. It's something we rarely do. But this richness and complexity, this richly informative world is only possible because your brain can build a practically infinite number of different world moments using this huge range of possible cortical column activation patterns. And so all of the possible worlds, if you like, that your brain can construct is this vast state space, this vast number of all possible patterns of cortical column activation, and we call this the world space. There are no worlds. There are no perceivable worlds that are not found within this world space, because this world space represents all possible patterns of cortical column activation. Now, of course, your brain doesn't explore all possible activation patterns. It explores only a very limited subset, which represent the meaningful model, functional and adaptive and useful model of the environment. So the normal waking world is represented by a small district, a small region within this vast world space. I've massively overrepresented the size here. It's actually going to be much, much smaller. So you spend, unless you take psychedelics, or perhaps some other techniques, you spend all of your waking life within this narrow region, or should I say your brain spends all of your waking life within this small district of this vast world space, which we referred to as the consensus reality space, this subset of cortical column activation patterns that represent the functional, adaptive, useful model of the environment. Okay, so let's look at how this works. Again, as I said, your world is changing every moment. This pattern of column activation is shifting and changing every single moment. Your brain, your cortex is moving from state to state, from pattern to pattern, so that you can represent that as a kind of walk through this district, this small region of the world space we refer to as the consensus reality space. Any questions so far? Is that good or bad? I'm not sure. So does what change?
Oh, 9 people here. You represent the graph there, the XY graph, as a particular space, and then is there a different particular space you can move to, which would relatively change?
Well, I will talk about, yes. Sorry, I'm just preparing something. Yes, so you can move to different regions of the space, which I'll talk about in a second, okay. But only under very limited circumstances, such as consuming DMT, for example. So the brain will naturally occupy, the cortex will naturally occupy this region of the world space. Yes?
Does use of certain substances, does it make a residual change in your normal space that you sort of live in?
It's changing all the time. It's changing all the time. Your brain is constantly, the connectivity. So it's the connectivity that determines which patterns, activation patterns, the brain is most likely to adopt. And that's always changing as you're learning, as you're developing, as you're changing and moving through life. these patterns are shifting slightly. So the world space itself doesn't change, right? Because it's all possible patterns of activation. It's all possible patterns of activation. What does change is which patterns your brain is most likely to move towards. Does that make sense? So here we can see a different region of the world space. So this is the DMT space. So this is the set of states, the set of cortical column activation patterns that represent all of the informational structure and dynamics of the DMT worlds. It's a different region of the world space that normally your brain doesn't have access to. It can't reach this part of the world space. It only sits within the consensus reality space. And this is because this consensus reality space, this small region of the world space, is in a kind of an attractor basin. It's low energy. These are favored states that the brain can reach. Let me see if no, I didn't put it on there. Yes?
Is the consensus reality space the most heavily favored state because of default by birth, or just by, over time, the brain adapts to that as a reality?
Exactly. So it's a combination of, there are certain patterns of connectivity. So it's all about connectivity, how the columns are connected. They will determine how columns speak to each other, how they activate each other. So they will determine the types of states, the types of column activation patterns your cortex reaches, right? And there's a combination. You are born with a certain basic set of connectivities in your brain. You are not a blank slate. You are born with an ability to construct a world model. So that's something that has been honed over evolutionary epochs. Your brain has evolved these patterns of connectivity. But then, as you develop and you start sampling information from the environment, your brain is constantly molding and changing this connectivity.
How formed is that when you're born?
That's a debatable point. Can you remember the moment of your birth, what the world looked like? I'm guessing no.
I don't remember much of yesterday afternoon.
But it's a good question. Yes.
If you are taking drugs like serotonin uptake inhibitors, or what if you? I had tragedy in my life, so I take the razapam and citrulline, which are serotonin uptake. What does that do to affect this? Or should someone
I will answer that question later because it will make more sense when I've gone a bit deeper.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I'll keep going for a bit. So the consensus reality space, it sits within this. So the whole of this world space, you can think of it as this landscape with hills and valleys. The low energy states are the states that the cortex is most likely to reach. They form this these attractor basins and valleys in much the same way that a glass marble is attracted to the base of a bowl. If you drop a glass marble into the bowl, it will go and then it will settle, right, at the lowest energy state. This is the attractor state. And so the brain has sculpted its connectivity, again, over evolutionary, developmental, and experiential epochs to lower the energy of those states that represent the functional model of the environment. So your brain spends all of its time in this little, relatively small region of the world space we call the consensus reality space. Now, these other worlds are represented by states in other areas of the world space. So there's a vast number. We could point out the DMT space, of course, but there are other regions But these are in the hills, if you like, of this world-space landscape. They're high energy. Your brain never gets to them normally. But they're there. But when you administer DMT, two things happen. There's this initial pre-breakthrough phase where the world-space landscape kind of flattens out. So the valleys are raised, the hills are lowered. The whole thing becomes much more flat. It becomes much easier for the brain to move between states and to reach states that are outside of the consensus reality space. So this is why, if you consume a low dose of magic mushrooms, for example, the brain has been observed using functional neuroimaging to move more freely between states and indeed to reach states that it doesn't ever reach in the normal waking state. So you're expanding the repertoire, expanding the number of states that the brain can reach. But with DMT, so this is kind of the first phase of DMT administration. You have this very disordered state. The world-space landscape is kind of flattening out and then restructuring itself. It reorganizes its geometry, and eventually it snaps or collapses into an entirely new shape, such that the states of the DMT space become attractors. They become low energy. You see this kind of behavior in other complex systems, by the way, where you can get a complete reorganization. One of the examples I talk about in the book is an ant society. So ants have different types of behavior, which are governed by interactions between the ants. So it forms this complex system. So when the ants are in let's say, trying to defend against an intruder, this is a whole pattern of behavior that is determined by the interactions between the ants. So you can imagine the ants within a small region of their entire state space. Then, let's say they need to cross some water. They can form themselves into a bridge. Some species of ants can form bridges. What they do is they change the interactions between themselves, and their emergent behavior suddenly changes. There's no one ant saying, we need to cross this water now. It kind of just happens. It's a remarkable thing. So the state space, if you like, the attractor landscape of this ant society is being restructured such that the states that represent this building a bridge behavior become attractor states. It's a little bit complicated, I know. But I talk about this a lot in reality switch technologies. So if you don't get it all, don't worry too much. So this is the breakthrough phase, this collapse of the world-space landscape into this new geometry where the states that represent the DMT world become attractive, they become low-energy states. This is the breakthrough experience. From your perspective, what is happening is you burst through into this new world. But in terms of what's happening in the brain, there is this restructuring of this world-space landscape. Okay, so what is the role of sensory information then? So we're getting into a little bit into information now. So the world that you experience, I've always said, is this model of the environment. It's always being built by the brain. Even when you're awake and looking around, navigating the environment. The world that you experience is always the model. It's always the model. I cannot emphasize that enough. You never have direct access to the environment. However, the brain is receiving sensory information from the environment all the time. It's sampling information from the environment, trying to match its model to patterns of information. It's called sensory matching. It's a type of model testing. Your brain is kind of asking the environment, is this model good? Is it working? Is it a functional model? Does it allow me to predict what's going to happen next? Does it make sense? So your brain is always doing that. It's a cycle of model testing. But your brain doesn't kind of record the environment like a video camera. It doesn't work like that. Your brain has to construct the model of the environment all the time. And it uses as little sensory information as it can get away with. As little sensory information as it can get away with. It really doesn't want to take information from the environment. It's very disruptive to have information flowing into your brain and activating all of these cortical columns. You have to it takes a lot of energy to process information from the environment. So your brain tries to keep it to a minimum. Huxley called it the reducing valve, right? The brain really doesn't want to take in information. But of course it needs to a certain extent. So the way we think about sensory, there are a number of ways of thinking about sensory information processing, and I don't want to go into too much detail here. But basically, you have your sensory information. Let's say we'll talk about the visual information because we are characteristically visual creatures, after all. Sensory information comes through the retina, stimulates these light-sensitive cells in the retina, which sends that information first right to the back of the brain, actually via this, but forget about that. Right to the back of the brain, the occipital lobe, in an area called V1, which makes perfect sense, of course, V1. And this picks up or processes basic features of the environment, lines in certain orientations, for example. Then that information is passed up. You have this hierarchy, passed up to V2, which puts these lines together and says, oh, that's maybe a triangle. So I will build a model of a triangle here. Then these patterns of information from V2 is passed further up into the hierarchy, and it puts together these shapes and says, oh, maybe that's a face, or maybe that's a dog. So all the time, your brain is constructing this model piece by piece from these very noisy patterns of sensory information. And so this is simplified. I haven't represented all the levels of this hierarchy, but you have this hierarchical processing. We can see it a little bit more clear here. Again, using our cortical column representation. You have the cortical columns in V1, this lowest area of the visual cortex, representing simple information. So here are where all the lines in certain orientations. There are other things, there's basic movement and color here, but we'll just keep it simple. Then that information, these columns represent these basic patterns, send information through their connections to the higher areas, and then right to the very top. So, again, here is your cortical column activation pattern. This is one world moment represented by this hierarchically constructed model from basic information all the way up to objects like faces and animals. Yes?
How long do these world moments last?
That's a very good question. So it's not like not like a movie where it's like frames. It's constantly changing. It's like a flow. It's like a flow of moments. It's easier to think of it as a series of snapshots, but actually it's much smoother. It's like a flow of moments. So the answer to your question is both. There isn't a kind of a time, if you know what I mean. Yeah, it's always flowing, changing. It's a smooth process. But it's easier, I think, to imagine it as a series of snapshots. So some columns will remain active for long periods of time. Others will become inactive. As other ones, it's constantly flowing. So hopefully you can make the connection between everything I was talking about earlier about these cortical column activation patterns and what you're seeing here. This is just that cortical column activation pattern. This is one state, one single location in that huge world space within the consensus reality space. So when you're awake, the sensory information, your brain is receiving sensory information. We call this a sensed world because it is indeed a world that is being sensed. We assume that there is some kind of mapping there. Certainly seems to be some kind of mapping between the model here and what's going on in the environment. We don't know that your brain is producing an accurate model or a true representation of the environment. Your brain doesn't care whether its model is true or correct. All it cares about is whether or not the model works. Is it a good model? Is it a functional model? Your brain has no way of knowing whether it's correct or true, so to speak. But it is a sensed world. It is mapped to sensory information from the environment. Now, when you dream at night, your brain continues constructing worlds. There have been many studies, scientific studies on dreaming, and for most people, not everyone, for most people, for most of the time, the dream world is practically continuous with the waking world. They've looked at the proportion of time you spend talking on the telephone or watching TV in people's dreams, and it's about the same as what you do in the waking world. So your brain is, and that makes sense, right? Your brain should only know how to construct one model of reality, one world, the normal waking world, and it uses the same model in the dream state. The difference, so the dream world is built in exactly the same way. It's built from the same stuff, patterns of cortical column activation. However, in the dream state, a few things are different, but primarily you've got a shutdown of the connection between these primary sensory areas of the cortex that normally receive information from the environment. That channel is cut. So your brain cannot receive information from the environment unless it's extremely strong sensory information. If there's an earthquake or a gunshot, that's probably more likely. Well, earthquake's more common in Japan, but well. Also, this is kind of interesting, these frontal areas of the brain. These are involved in what's referred to as executive function. One thing that your brain is constantly doing, you don't realize this, is saying, it's kind of asking itself in a way. Does all of this make sense? Is there anything odd? Is there anything unusual going on here that I need to take note of? Now, when you're in a dream, you might notice some very strange things happen. You know, you might be sitting in your front garden, or washing your car or something, and then suddenly you find yourself in an aircraft, or you're talking to your girlfriend, and she suddenly changes into a dog or something. You know, some very weird things can happen in dreams, but you never go, or rarely, unless you're a lucid dreamer, rarely do you go, that's fucking weird. You take it for granted. Oh, she's turned into a dog, whatever. And that's because these frontal areas of the brain, this executive function is kind of also inhibited. It's kind of shut down, so you don't notice the weird things when they're happening. You just take them for granted. And so learning to lucid dream is partly about reactivating these frontal parts of the brain in the dream state, training these parts of the brain to become active again, such that you can recognize that something odd. That's weird. That can't happen. That's impossible. This must be a dream. Yes?
I know that I'm not sure what the mechanism is. Oh, thank you. I don't know what the mechanism is, but I know that the brain has some shut-off switch so that your body doesn't act out what happens.
Yeah.
And that makes complete sense. Is the shutdown of the executive areas, the frontal areas, just to allow them to recuperate because they're not really needed during that time?
Well, a lot of it is speculation. I mean, obviously, the inhibition of your musculature, so the motor function, that's obvious why you need to do that, so you don't act out your dreams. There are conditions, rare neurological conditions, where people do act out their dreams and get themselves into really hairy situations, extremely dangerous, you know. But yeah, you could think of it something like that. You know, it could be that it's a protective mechanism to stop you recognizing you're in a dream and disrupting the dream state. You know, the dream state probably has numerous functions. One of them is almost certainly to consolidate memories. So you get like a replay. So you have again, I don't want to get too much detail, but you have, when you have, in the waking state, you have certain experiences. And that information is passed to the hippocampus, this deep part of the brain, the side of the brain, kind of underneath the temporal lobes or on the inner side of the temporal lobes. And that kind of creates kind of an index of this experience. And then when you're dreaming, the hippocampus starts firing and starts replaying a lot of these experiences to kind of consolidate them, to kind of practice them, if you like, to build up those new connections so that you can maintain those memories. So dreaming is probably important for that. It might have other functions as well, but it's probably important for that. So you don't want that disrupted by an overactive frontal cortex. That's just a hypothesis, right? I can't say that's certainly the case. So dreaming, again, is what we call a dreamt world. So it's the opposite, or different to a sensed world, in that it's not mapped directly to the sensory, to the environment. It's not mapped to sensory information, so it's isolated in this way. But it's still built in the same way. It's still built as a pattern of cortical column activation. So the question then, perhaps the most important question, the absolutely fundamental question, the answer to which we all want to know, is the DMT world a sensed world, or is it a dreamt world? Is it a world that is receiving information from some other place? Is it a world that, like the normal waking world, is being mapped to some other environment? I would suggest that is the case, because as I said earlier, your brain evolved to construct only one model of the world, which is the model of the environment. That's what this world model is for. It's to allow you to navigate and survive and reproduce, etc., within the environment. That's what it's for. That's what it evolved to construct, this model of the environment. So its ability to construct without guidance of sensory information, its ability to construct this bizarre but crystalline, clear and coherent, highly complex, alternate model without sensory information is difficult for me to believe. So it makes sense to me that this DMT world, this alternate model, is indeed being mapped, is indeed receiving information from some other place. And that sensory information is guiding the construction of this alternate model in the same way that sensory information guides the construction of your normal waking world model. Yes.
What biochemistry of your brain does DMT interact with?
Getting to that. You're preempting me a little bit. It's okay. Yes, I will get to that.
So I got a question. Now, in the DMT world, is our V1 and our executive brain still working like it would be as we were awake?
Yep, and I'll get to that as well.
Okay, cool.
But it's good you're thinking of these things. So Okay, so the DMT world. So the question then is, if the DMT world really is mapped to some alternate source of sensory information, what's the mechanism of that? How is that possible? How can the brain receive information from some other place, whether you call it another dimension or an alternate parallel universe or something else? What's the mechanism here? How does that work? We understand the mechanism of sensory information from the environment, but what's this source of information, this alternate sensory information from this other place? So that's really what I want to talk about, is potential mechanisms for this. So is DMT world a sensed world, or is it a dreamt world? And I think, hopefully, I've convinced you that the dreamt world explanation, the idea the brain is just making it up, as many other neuroscientists would have you believe, doesn't make any sense to me. So here's another way of looking at this information problem. Here's our world space. Here's the consensus reality space. We know it's mapped to some other space, what we call the environment, whatever that thing is outside that we never really have true access to. Here's the DMT space, that set of states that your brain can reach under the influence of DMT. Is that also mapped to some other alternate environment, some other world inhabited by these beings? This is the $64,000 question. Does that still run? Yeah? It's got to be more than that now, though, right? $1 million question. Okay. Could be. I won't get into quantum stuff because I'm not a physicist. Yes, okay. So that kind of represents the crux of the issue. This is the problem. We know the brain can reach this alternate area of the world space. We know it can do it because you can take DMT and you'll reliably go to these strange worlds. We know the brain can construct these alternate models. That's not an issue. That's an easy question to answer. Yes, the brain can do this. It can reach these other areas of the world space. And I explained yesterday and a little bit today how that happens by this restructuring of the world space landscape. This is the real question that everyone wants to know the answer to. Is it being mapped to some alternate source of sensory information? And if so, what's the mechanism? So today I will kind of assume that the answer to that question is yes. Otherwise, well, we can all go home. And if so, what could be the mechanism? Yes.
Just a quick question. So
Yeah.
the dreamt world, what does that map to?
It's not mapped. Yep, that's the point, right? It's that your dreamt world, yep, so is not mapped to anything. It's constructing.
It's just replaying.
It's just replaying, yeah. It's building the world in the same way as it does during waking, but without mapping.
I get it. Dummy.
To sensory information. Good question. Okay. So, in my first talk way back now, and I think it's important to stress, again, to repeat, that you're not going anywhere. To explain the DMT experience or to explain these DMT worlds, this alternate reality model, you don't have to go somewhere. You don't have to go to that world. Nothing has to flow from our universe into this other place. It also simplifies the problem somewhat. We don't have to provide a mechanism for traveling anywhere. What's actually happening is there is a flow of information. Remember this sensory mapping, this mapping of information to the world model being constructed by the brain. This information is flowing from other into your brain, and your brain is using that as an alternate source of sensory information to construct this alternate world model. So that's all we need to explain. How does the information get into your brain? And of course, we're all familiar with the flow of information into the brain, sensory information, speech information. What I'm doing now is taking information in my brain, converting it into sound information, into patterns of sound, which is, of course, is a form of information, and tickling your brain, getting that information in your brain, hopefully to achieve some kind of transmission, some kind of comprehensible transmission of information. So we're used to the idea. It's something we're all familiar with, the idea of information flowing into our brains. And of course, again, I showed this in my first lecture, virtual reality, again, you're manipulating the sensory information. You're manipulating the visual information. You're changing the sensory information such that the world model changes. That's all you're doing. Yes?
And during our AI panel yesterday, Matthew Bailey said something to the effect that there are 23 sensory capabilities. I had never heard anything like that. Was that a familiar idea to you?
What do you think? I don't want to.
Let's just leave that luxuriating in its rhetorical splendor.
Yes. Okay, so that brings us back. So that, weirdly, no, that was just the preamble. Bloody hell. So hopefully now you understand the importance of this information. The information being generated that is your world model by these patterns of cortical column activation, the information that flows into the brain to guide the construction of this world model. It's all about information. This is why information is so important. So let's go into, this is the intensive after all, a little bit more detail. A little bit more detail. So your world model, the key point, is a highly complex pattern of information. Now I want you to understand this a little bit more deeply. So, your world model, a pattern of cortical column activation. This is indeed a pattern of information. Why is it a pattern of information? I've kind of assumed that that would make sense to you, calling it a pattern of information. Well, what is information? Well, there are a number of ways to define it, but the way that I like, the simplest, most fundamental way of describing information is something that's generated when a system selects between a finite number of distinct states. Now, that is a bit of a mouthful, but we're all familiar with this idea. So, Paul, call it?
Heads.
Yes, you win. I don't know if it's heads. It's a Japanese coin, so it's a souvenir for you. So what did I do there? We had a coin. A coin has how many states? Don't count the one on the edge. Yeah. 2. Yep. 2 states. So when you flip the coin, you spin the coin lands and it selects one of those states. You gain information when you look at the coin. How much information do you gain? 1 bit of information. This is a bit. When a system selects between 2 states, you gain information. But we don't have to use a coin to generate information like this. We could use a dice or a die. That has how many states does a die have? 6. Yeah, a regular die. Yeah. 6 faces, 6 states. So when you roll a die, lands, you gain information because it's selecting one of those states. You actually gain more information when you roll a dice because there are 6 states to choose from. Bits. Yes. How many states does binary code have? Yes, binary. 2 states, 1 or 0. So a single bit is not a lot of information, but you can string these bits together. You can form binary strings, and you can generate inordinate amounts of highly complex and rich information using strings of bits. So bits are perhaps the most widely used, well, almost certainly the most widely used form of information, but it's just a system that's selecting between a finite number of states. That's our definition of information. In the case of binary, it's just 2 states, so 1 or a 0. That's it. What does this remind you of? What does this remind you of? Yes, go back to columns. Why? Who said columns? Why?
I mean, essentially, it's on or it's off.
Right. So a cortical column, right? So here we have a system. This is a more general system. Could be a coin. Yeah? It has 1 state, has 2 states. Yeah, it could be a 0, it could be a 1, it could be a plus or a minus. It could be an on or an off. It could be an active or an inactive. Wait a second. Forget that. Cortical columns. Yes, our cortical columns, we said, they can be on or they can be off, active or inactive. So the column is always selecting. So between one of 2 states. That's how your cortical columns are generating information. It should make perfect sense now. So just like you can generate lots of information using a string of binary digits, 1s and 0s, you can create vast amounts of information by having lots of cortical columns. That's what your cortex is. Lots of these cortical columns. Millions of these cortical columns. Each cortical column can be in one of 2 states. Each cortical column generates a bit of information. It's actually a little bit more complex than that because they actually have a number of states, but keep it simple. So this is why I've been saying your world is built from information. We can explain this using very, very, very basic information theory. So each pattern of cortical columns, you can think, is a single state. Because we've got millions of cortical columns, we've got an infinite number of states. So when your brain generates vast amounts of information by combining all of these cortical columns. So here we can understand finally why I referred to this as information. Each cortical state, each cortical activation pattern is a large set of these cortical columns, each of which generates a small amount of information, but together generates vast, vast amounts of information. All the information in your world, your experienced subjective world at any point in time. It's kind of an amazing thing. Okay, let's go deeper. So we found information. We found information at the level of cortical columns. I'm going to show you that actually there is information at every level. It's information all the way down. So the columns generate information. They can be active or inactive. But of course the columns themselves, as I showed earlier, there we go, are built from these little cells called neurons. I often refer to neurons as information-generating cells. That's what they do. Neurons generate information. So we seem to have a column generating information, but also the neurons within them are also generating their own information. This is how the columns kind of compute. Now, can we explain why I call this information? So here's a neuron, an actual neuron, an electron micrograph of a neuron. So we have, this is called the cell body of the neuron. We have this long thing here. This is an axon, and we have these dendrites. They receive information. These dendrites, they pass it. I think I have a schematic here. Yeah, this is better. They receive information. They process, the cell body processes information, and sends the result out along this axon to the end. It's called a synaptic bulb, and passes it to another neuron. So neurons are information processing. It's interesting. Each neuron is functioning at a micro scale in the same way that the entire brain is functioning. If you think about what your brain is doing, your brain is taking information all the time from the environment, processing it, thinking, conscious thinking as well as lots of unconscious processes, and then it responds. You move, for example. So, good, right? So, I threw the bottle to Andrew. His brain, saw this, had to decide what the fuck is going on here. Yes? And then very, very quickly, there was a response. There was an output. So input, process, output. Yeah, that's what your brain is doing. A very simple, basic level, that's what your brain is. Takes information in, process, does something, output. That's also what every single neuron in your brain is doing. Takes information in through the dendrites, process, output. Communicates with other neurons. Very interesting. As above, so below. So what does this information look like? Well, neurons, they generate these things called action potentials. These are electrochemical signals. If you measure the electrical activity of a neuron, you will see these spikes, little jumps in the electrical potential, electrical activity. I think I have... Here you can see, this is a recording of some neurons. So each of these spikes, so you can think of each of these spikes as being like the other state of the neuron. The neuron can be basically in two states. It can be quiet, or it can fire. Yeah, so it's like a two-state system, and it's been described by many neuroscientists as kind of like zeros and ones. Again, this is a recording of a neuron over time. You can see these patterns of spikes, patterns of these action potentials. I've labeled it helpfully there. You can think of it as like 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1. Yes? Information. It's like a string of binary code. So we get information again. So the columns are generating information by selecting between active and inactive. And also, all the neurons from which the columns are constructed are generating information. Okay, let's bring some psychedelics into the picture. So we have, in the middle here, serotonin. This is your natural neuromodulator, your endogenous neuromodulator, one of them, one of many. Then we have on the right, we have LSD, which is rather more complex. But if you look carefully, you can see the same ring structure here. 2 carbons to a nitrogen, 2 carbons to a nitrogen. You have this other structure that's added on here. LSD, the most potent psychedelic known to science. When I say potent, I mean the dosage, the amount you require to achieve an effect, not necessarily the intensity of the effect. DMT is much more intense at regular doses, but it's less potent. You need around 30 to 50 milligrams of DMT, whereas you only need millionths of a gram of LSD. It's a remarkable molecule that Albert Hofmann synthesized or discovered, shall we say, all those years ago. Okay. So how does a psychedelic work? So we've spoken already about these neurons, these information-generating cells. I explained why they're generating information. The neuron is surrounded by a membrane, as all cells are, and embedded in this membrane are a a large array of special proteins that are called receptors. And these receptors, the purpose of a receptor is basically, it's a way for molecules outside of the neuron to speak to the inside of the neuron. A molecule binds to the receptor that is in an inactive state. This is a serotonin receptor called the 5-HT2A receptor. There are about 16 subtypes of serotonin receptors. And psychedelics, the classic psychedelics, including DMT, specifically bind to this serotonin 2A receptor subtype. So the receptor is in an inactive state. It's not speaking to the inside of the neuron. DMT, or serotonin, or some other classic psychedelic, binds to the 5-HT2A receptor and switches it into an active state. Receptors they're types of proteins. Proteins are these delicately folded, quite malleable structures in most cases, not all proteins. You can distort them. You can twist them out of shape. When a molecule binds to a receptor, it changes the shape of the receptor. It kind of twists into a new conformation, which allows it to communicate with these other molecules inside the neuron called signaling proteins. So the DMT doesn't have to go into the neuron. It just binds to the receptor, and the receptor, which does pass through the membrane, it sits in the membrane and has access to the outside and the inside, then can speak to the inside of the neuron. Inactive, active. What's that? Inactive, active. Oh, there we go, yes? Binary, yes? Two states. So DMT is selecting one of these states, generating information. When the receptor shifts from one state to the next, it is generating information. So again, this kind of shows what goes on with the receptor. Here's the receptor in the inactive state. It shifts through this conformational change. Goes from an inactive to an active state. When, I've got LSD here, but it could be DMT or whatever, some classic psychedelic binds, so it shifts it from an inactive to an active state. We're moving between states. We are generating information. Don't worry about the details here. But again, we can look a little bit deeper. We will see there is more information to be found. So when the 5-HT2A receptor is occupied, it switches to an active state, and it binds to this protein here called a G protein, which is activated. The G protein switches from an inactive to an active state. There's more information. The G protein then activates this PLC, phospholipase C. Don't worry about that. It's not important. But again, it has an inactive and it has an active state. So more information. Phospholipase C causes more activation, splits this into two molecules. This is inactive. These are active. So again, we're switching between states. So we can see information is generated here and then flows through this complex subcellular network of signaling protein. This is extremely simplified. This is another way of visualizing it. I've used the same symbols as for the cortical columns to drive this point home. DMT binds, activates the receptor, generates information. That information flows. So we get a pattern of activation of these signaling molecules. This should remind you, of course, of the pattern of cortical column activation. So we've gone from information being generated, the level of cortical columns, to information, patterns of information being generated by neurons with these spikes, to patterns of information being generated and flowing through the inside of the neuron itself. Information down, 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 down. This is a bit more representative. This is from a model, computational model I constructed a few years ago when I was working in Okinawa. You can see there's a lot more going on than I showed in the first slide. Many more molecules, signaling molecules, interacting, information flowing, pattern of information flowing through the inside of the cell. This is even more complex version. This is probably more representative of the true nature of things, yeah? Yeah. Yeah. So there's a kind of a zoomed in picture of just a small section of this, yeah? So this is just a single neuron, by the way. Yep. And this is incomplete. Right? This is incomplete. But just what many of these pathways, this flow of information pathways that have been mapped and studied by biochemists. You know, each one of these little things, there's probably quite a few PhDs that have been received by studying, you know, this and this and this and this. Seriously, you know, you don't realize how much blood, sweat, and tears went into over many decades mapping all of these different processes and all those interactions. Just think about all the different publications that had to be kind of cross-linked. You know, someone might just work on one connection, one interaction, and how that works. And then we kind of, over the decades, kind of put it all together and start to get a picture of the way that a neuron functions, basically, or a cell functions. It's a incredibly complex system. So it should remind you of something. It reminds you, of course, of a circuit board, right? So what does a circuit board do? Well, it directs the flow of information. And so each of these signaling proteins is directing the flow of information in a certain way. And you can think of that as the components of a circuit board. Would you like to have a break? Yes. Yeah, let's have 5 minutes. Come on.
Maybe 6.
Okay. Absolutely. But what we do.
Pisses me off, and I don't know why I asked for them. I think where your presentation is just seeing advance and open up whole new vistas.
Mm.
You would be willing to fly to Tucson if it wasn't in the summer. I live there.
Oh, really? Oh, yeah, I was there a few years ago. Oh, I forget when it was now, but maybe 2015, something like that. No, it was before that. Maybe 2013, 14. Yeah. Tononi was there. Giulio Tononi, who also is not a fan of. He does the integrated information theory of consciousness. Which is completely different to Hameroff's, so they're kind of in academic conflict there. So I lean more towards what Giulio Tononi is doing with his integrated information theory than I do towards microtubule quantum thing.
Gary Schwartz, when he's at UA?
No.
He's got 6 PhDs. One is in surgery.
Wow.
And he's doing this paradigm. How do you explain it? He's a piece of work, and he's in Hameroff in 2 different camps, right in the same building.
Wow.
He's a psychologist, I guess would be the best. He's in the Department of Psychology.
Right.
Hameroff is a anesthesiologist.
Mm.
I'd like to get you in the middle.
Oh.
Triangulate.
Maybe. Yeah. It would, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Of course.
I'm from Massachusetts. If I wanted to try DMT, do you have any recommendations?
Well, I always say, it's the simplest, easiest way is to extract it yourself. So get some Mimosa hostilis root bark, which you can buy on the internet, and in your kitchen. You can do it in an afternoon. Yeah.
I'm a molecular geneticist.
Well, there you go. This will be easy for you. Yeah.
But I gotta,
Yeah, I mean, it won't be any problem for someone of your credentials.
but what's this stuff?
Mimosa hostilis. I can write it down if you have a... In the United States, I don't know. There's many sellers. I mean, it's very popular, as you can imagine. Yeah, Mimosa hostilis root bark. It's
for the process of the extraction.
for the process of the extraction, you need some Zippo lighter fluid, some drain cleaner. That's basically it, and a few hours. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so you basify, all you're doing is you get your root bark, grind it up, or some people don't grind it up, basify it, sodium hydroxide, basically. If you get good pure sodium hydroxide, it's better. And then you're forming the free base of the DMT. Then you extract it with your Zippo, lighter fluid. You use a turkey baster or something to take the hydrocarbon off, lay it in a glass dish, let it evaporate. Bob's your uncle, as they say.
That question from Hunnick about the senses, which obviously a number of senses, but proprioception's a real thing, right?
Oh, yes.
Is that a sense?
Yeah. I mean, he might be, I'm not saying he's wrong,
Right.
but I've never heard that number.
Right, but you're right, but
I think it seems to be, yeah. Yeah.
like your ability to sense the winning lottery number. I mean,
Yeah, of course. That's the other sense, yeah. That's sense 27. Yeah. Okay. So I gave a chance for those. What? So hopefully had a good break. There's also an opportunity for some people maybe to escape. Your nicotine in. Okay, let's keep going. So as I was saying before the break, it's information all the way down, or so far at least. We've got from the level of cortical activity, cortical column activation generating information, through down to neurons generating information, through down to the actual subcellular signaling networks also generating information. So it's information all the way down. Okay, I'll talk about this a little bit. So I showed you this simplified diagram of the signaling network inside a neuron that's activated by the binding of the classic psychedelics, such as DMT or LSD or whatever, to this 5-HT2A receptor, information flowing through the inside of the neuron. Now, these 5-HT2A receptors are found particularly, so this is a collection of cells, a collection of neurons called pyramidal cells, thus called because you have to use your imagination a little bit here. They kind of have a pyramidal structure. They have the cell body. Remember that information processing part of the neuron? They have this axon, and they also have this long dendritic tree. So it's kind of roughly pyramid-shaped, kind of. And these pyramidal cells, the cell bodies actually sit in these deeper layers of the cortical columns, and these dendritic tree, as it's called, this long dendritic tree reaches right up to the outer layers. So this is kind of showing that, just isolating these pyramidal cells. So these 5-HT2A receptors are in the membrane of these neurons, in these part of this dendritic part of the pyramidal cell. So this is where DMT is going when it gets into your brain, into this binding specifically to these 5-HT2A receptors that are heavily expressed. There's lots of them in these pyramidal cells. So again, a simpler representation. You have a column. There's obviously many of these pyramidal cells, not just one, as I've shown here. DMT binds to the 5-HT2A receptors on these dendrites. And these columns, of course, are connected. So we have this branched axon. Remember, the axon is the output part of the neuron. It allows the pyramidal cell to communicate, to speak to other columns, to form these connections between the columns. So let's look at some of these connections. Let's try to explain why psychedelics have this effect on the structure of your world model. So here we have a few cortical columns, 12 cortical columns for simplicity. And let's put in some connections. So we'll call these strong connections. These solid lines, we'll call these strong connections. There are also lots of weaker connections. So I said at the beginning that the patterns of connections determine the states that your cortex reaches. I'm going to explain why that's the case now. So let's imagine that some sensory information activates these columns. What's going to happen next? Yeah, so remember, you have these connections between the columns. Yeah, the information can flow. So we're activating this column, the information can flow. So this connection can be strong, it can be weak, and it can change. It's called synaptic plasticity, or one type of synaptic plasticity. So yes, these columns are activated. You form the complete pattern. So you form a pattern of column of activation by these stronger connections. Information tends to flow more freely between columns that are connected strongly. So this is why this particular pattern emerges, yes? Because of these connections. If you change the connections, then you change the patterns of column activation that you achieve. So that's why your brain is constantly remolding and changing its connections to refine the patterns that form this model of the world. Now, when a psychedelic enters the brain, so again this image activates the 5-HT2A receptor, ultimately what happens is you get an effect on some channel proteins called potassium channels. Don't worry about the details. But basically, a number of things happen when this 5-HT2A receptor is activated. And the information flows through and is kind of processed by the inside of the neuron. But the overall effect is that the neuron becomes more excitable. What that means is it becomes more likely to fire action potentials. It's more easy to stimulate. It's in a slightly more excitable state. And also, it fires more frequently. So this is our control state without the 5-HT2A stimulation. And you can see these quite widely spaced action potentials. When you stimulate the 5-HT2A receptor, it makes the neuron more excitable, and so it's more easy. It's easier for it, the neuron, to be stimulated and made to fire, so you see more activity. So this state is the more activated state. These neurons within these cortical columns are in a more activated state because of the presence of the psychedelic. So it's easier to activate the columns, in other words, because it's easier to activate these neurons that the columns are built from. It's easier to activate the cortical columns. What that means is that it's easier for even weak connections to cause columns to become active. So you don't have to just rely on these very strong connections. So this is kind of like a democratization, if you like, of cortical columns. More columns can become activated. Information can start to flow between columns much more easily. And so instead of getting this regular pattern, we start to see these novel patterns emerging. And the brain can move more freely between different activation patterns. That, of course, is the psychedelic state that I was describing. I also described it as a flattening of this world-space landscape. This is why the world-space landscape flattens, because the cortex can reach states, move between states more easily, because these cortical columns are in a more excitable state. They can communicate much more freely between each other, even with, they're less controlled by the connectivity, in other words. So this, in very simple terms, is why you get this change in the structure and dynamics of your world under the influence of a psychedelic, and you get these novel patterns of activation. So this is something that I wrote about. I predicted, basically, this is how it worked, that the psychedelics make this a much larger repertoire of columns accessible to this dynamic and shifting pattern of cortical column activation. And a few years later, this was actually observed. So I showed this yesterday, that the brain, when you monitor neural activity using functional MRI, you see this flattening of the landscape. You observe the cortex moving through states more freely. And yesterday I described this as like a hot state of the cortex. Now this has some interesting consequences, because not only can the cortex in the psychedelic state move more freely between states, it's also much more sensitive to incoming information. It's much easier for information to enter the brain and kind of take control. Again, it's like if you heat up a piece of glass it's rigid, it's solid. You heat it up and then you can much more easily mold it to your shape. It's much more sensitive to your inputs. And so broadly, what I'm saying here is that in the normal waking state, the brain is in kind of a rigid state. It has it's controlled by these patterns of connectivity that determine the structure of the world, determine the states your brain can reach. Sensory information has some influence here, but it's still limited by the states that the brain can reach. This is why your world is very stable and predictable in the normal waking state. In the psychedelic state, your brain reaches this more fluid, hot state, like a heated piece of glass, which makes it much more sensitive to incoming information. It's a more malleable state, much more susceptible to what I call here information-driven reorganization. So this should give you some inkling of where I'm going with this, hopefully. Your brain is more susceptible to information. Information can take control of your cortex. Information from elsewhere. And as I've said many times, relating this specifically to DMT, you don't break through into the DMT world. The DMT world breaks through into you. Your brain is in this malleable hot state. It is sensitive, becomes sensitive to this incoming information. The information from these other realm takes control of your brain's world-building machinery, uses your brain to build its world. Okay. So let's dive into this a little bit more deeply. The flow of information into your world. Well, how does that work? The flow of information from this other space into your brain. Well, I think we're ready now to kind of put the picture together in some sense. We've looked at the cortex. We've looked how the cortex constructs a world model using these patterns of column activation. And we've seen that these columns are built from networks of neurons that are connected. And that these neurons themselves are constructed from lots of molecules. Each neuron is effectively, you saw this highly complex network that I showed you, subcellular network. You also have, of course, the membrane and other structures, but it's this whole unified structure built from molecules. So the world model, you can see it it emerges from this lowest level, or this lower level. Molecules interact. Information flows between them. From the molecules, the neuron, with all of its function and its behavior, emerges. These neurons connect to form neural networks, which have their own emergent behavior. And from all of this, at the highest level, the cortex, your world model, your pattern of cortical column activation, your world model emerges. So there is this emergence flowing up from the level of molecules. Your world model falls out of this process, this upwards flow of information, sometimes referred to as upwards causation. That's kind of a confusing term. Yes? Causation is the flow of information. So we've seen information at every level. This information flows upwards from the molecular level all the way up to the world model level. And you also now understand why we call this information, why we refer to this as information at every level. Now, information also flows in the opposite direction. This is a little bit trickier to understand, but information is not just flowing upwards, but activity in the cortex is also affecting the way that the networks of neurons behave, which affects the individual neurons, which also affects the molecules. So you get this flow of information from upwards and downwards. Your world is constantly emerging all the time, just as a whirlpool is constantly emerging. The whirlpool is not static, it's defined by its dynamics. The whirlpool doesn't just emerge and stop, it's always emerging. Your world model is also always emerging, constantly and changing. Sensory information, as we have seen, enters at this neuronal level, stimulating particular neurons, which activates them. And so information is flowing inwards also from the environment. We don't have to settle at this level, though. If I give you a knock on the head, you might see some bright lights or you might see some flashes. If anyone's ever been popped, imagine you've had a few scuffles in your time, Paul. Of course. So there, if you get a knock on the head, you are directly stimulating physically the cortex. So this is also information input, which also can stimulate some neural activity and cause these flashes of light that you might see. So information can enter this flow, this upwards and downwards flow at other levels. But we needn't stop there. We can go down even further. So molecules, well, they emerge. Molecules emerge from the interactions between atoms. We can say that atoms emerge from the interactions between subatomic particles, and they emerge, and we go deeper and deeper and deeper, right down to the ground of reality. So in fact, what's happening is that your world is emerging not just from the molecular level, your world is emerging from the ground of reality itself. Information is flowing upwards to these higher and higher levels of organization. And at the pinnacle, we have your world model at the top.
Where in this process is the brain doing all of those recalibrations to reassess its predictive capabilities on the model? Is that a separate process? But so this highly dynamic information flow,
Yeah.
may be unrelated to what you mentioned about how the brain is kind of like a scientific method, always reevaluating how accurately the model is it's forming.
Yes. So
So does that occur as part of this network here?
it's happening. So well, let me ask you the question. So so how is that model testing working? What's changing when the model changes?
New input?
It could be, yeah. So input is changing. Good, yeah. So you have information coming in here, but also the connections, of course, are also being changed. So the information being generated at this level is also changing, as is the information flowing in from the environment. The information from the environment is always changing, but the information being generated at this level, and indeed at this level, is also always changing. The information being generated at each level is also always changing. And as the information changes, of course, the information that flows upwards to the higher level also is changing. This is why your world model changes. So it's always this flow of information up and down. That makes sense. So yesterday I spoke about, if you were at the panel, this murmuration. The murmuration of Starling. There's no central controller. There's no orchestrator. There's no choreographer that dictates this dynamic behavior. It emerges from the interactions between the starlings. Each starling is interacting in rather simple ways, according to very simple rules, with neighboring starlings, just like neurons are interacting with other neurons, or cortical columns are interacting with other cortical columns. And this beautiful dynamic behavior emerges. So your world is emerging in the same way. And you could also say each of the individual starling is itself emerging from its cellular structure, all the way down through to subcellular molecular networks and all that stuff. So everything is emerging all the time. You can model, this is a computer model of a murmuration. Again, each of these, what are called agents, that simulates an individual bird, is programmed to behave according to just a handful, very small number of very simple rules. Basically, the rules governing the interactions between the bird and its neighbors. And from that, you can replicate this murmuration behavior. So just like we showed our world model emerging, we can think of different. We can think of the murmuration as the in terms of the bird level, the lower level, information flowing upwards to the flock level, to the level of the murmuration, but information also flowing in the opposite direction as well. The way that the shape and the form and the dynamics of the flock influence, to some degree, the individual birds. So you get this downwards flow of information as well. So it's always up and down information flow. This is the key to emergence. So let's go really, 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 really deep. Ed Fredkin, an amazing computer scientist at Carnegie Mellon, had this to say. So we've looked at down to the molecular level, and I said, we can think of molecules emerging from atoms and atoms emerging from subatomic particles. What's really at the ground of reality? What's really at the ground of reality? It was Ed Fredkin's contention that it was information at the base of it all, and not just Ed Fredkin either. A number of people, most significantly a man whose name came up yesterday, Stephen Wolfram, also believes that information, digits, lie at the ground of reality, that reality at the very lowest level is a digital structure. It's quantized, it's discrete, it has these individual pieces that can exist in a small number of states. So just like our cortical columns can exist in a small number of states, or our neurons, or our protein receptors, at the ground of reality, we have these small number of states. If we could look into a tiny region of space with a magic microscope so that we could see what was there at the very bottom of the scale of length, we would find something like a seething bed of random appearing activity. Space would be divided into cells, and at each instant of time, each cell would be in one of a few states. So this is the fundamental information at the ground of reality. A snapshot will reveal patterns of 2 or 3 or 4, some other small integer kinds of distinguishable states, pluses or minuses, blacks and whites, 7 shades of grey, ups and downs. It doesn't matter. Yeah, as long as we have discrete, distinct states, that's what we require to generate information. It will be equivalent to digits. What is this? Yes, this is the game of life. So this is was invented by a mathematician a wonderful, amazing mathematician called John Conway. And he discovered that if you take a grid like this, you discretize, you break up the space, this two-dimensional space, into individual units, he called cells, and you provide some basic rules for how a cell moves from state to state. He has certain rules here. So a single cell is in one of 2 states at any point in time. I put grey and blue, but it could be black and white or whatever, it doesn't matter. 2 states. And each cell at each point in time, so this game kind of updates one moment after the next. Each cell looks at its neighbors and counts how many of its neighbors are in the alive state, shall we say. He also described as dead and alive, but it's just 2 states, 0, 1, black or white, whatever. So if there's less than 2 living neighbors, then it dies of loneliness. So it shifts from the alive state to the dead state. I hope I've got this right, maybe not, but anyway. If it's got more than 3 living neighbors, then it dies of overcrowding. So it goes from the alive state to the dead state. If it's got precisely 2 or 3, it keeps on living. It stays in the alive state. If, on the other hand, it's already in the dead state and it has precisely 3 living neighbors, it comes alive. Those are the rules. 4 simple rules for how each cell Each information-generating cell updates based upon each click of time. And using these 4 rules, very complex things can emerge. Believe it or not, this is the game of life. These are emergent patterns in the game of life. It looks like, I'll show that again, it looks like things are moving. But they aren't. Nothing's moving. All that's happening is that the cells are updating their state. Nothing moves. But you form these structures that appear to move. It's an updating, a rippling of these state changes of these cells. And you can get some really wild structures. So you get these spaceships actually self-constructing. Yeah. And when they're built, they fly off. Yeah. This is just those 4 rules. So it kind of shows you, obviously reality isn't the game of life. It isn't based upon these 4 rules, but it really makes it clear how you can start with very basic, simple rules of interaction between very simple digital systems, and immense complexity can emerge. So at the ground of our reality, we have this fundamental rule set. We don't know what it is. Wolfram, I think, said it could probably be written on the back of an envelope or something. The key to our reality. And everything emerges from this level upwards. So again, you can see he's firing these. These are called gliders, these particular forms, because they appear to glide across the screen. And you have these types of guns which fire these glider guns. I'm going backwards. And just to show you, actually, that nothing is actually moving here, you can see the update of this glider over time. So it appears to have shifted, but all that's happened is that there's been an updating of the states according to these 4 rules. You can also get more complex structures. So you can think of this as being a first order kind of structure. And these structures can then emerge from these structures, larger, more complex structures. So I refer to this as a first order structure, but then they can form larger emergent structures. So this is just like, well, here's a really good example. Amazing, right? So it's like a huge spaceship that's kind of, you maybe can't see it here, it's actually firing. So this is what you might call a high order structure. It's built from smaller structures. And this should be reminiscent, should remind you of what's going on in our brain. We have molecules that interact and form, so the molecules kind of emerge, and then they interact and form larger structures, these neurons, which then interact. So it's this emerging levels all the way up from the ground of reality. And this is some slightly different type of model. But again, these simple rules governing the interactions between these particles, and you start to get what seems to be cells almost that can interact with each other. And there's a lot of computer scientists and biomodelers have explored how you can get this beautiful emergent behavior from very, very simple rules. So now we have a more complete picture of our reality. We started thinking about organs. Well, one organ in particular, the brain, right? Now, the idea that our world emerges from this cortical column pattern of cortical column activation, but we can apply this more generally to living organisms. You might think of the organism being at the highest level of this hierarchy of complexity. The organism emerges from your organs. The organs themselves emerge from tissues. The tissues emerge from cells. So this is the kind of where life is defined. Once you get cells, then you have life. So everything in blue here is living. The cells themselves emerge from molecules, which emerge from atoms, which emerge from so-called fundamental particles, which are probably not fundamental. And then right down at the base of reality, this is where Ed Fredkin's digital structure is, or Stephen Wolfram's digital structure. This pure information generating system, and everything emerges, flows upwards to the highest level. And today we were talking specifically about this world model that is being constructed. So your model of the world is always emerging from the base of reality. So we can say something like this: everything is a manifestation of the complexification of information. It's information all the way down, constantly emerging upwards and complexifying and self-organizing. Okay, so before I talk the kind of the final bit of this talk, I want to briefly talk about, and I will relate what I spoke about, the information there, to DMT. But at the beginning of the talk, I kind of asked the question of whether this DMT world is indeed mapped to some other environment, whether there is indeed a flow of information that's entering the brain as an alternate sensory information source. And the question, we think it should be answered in the affirmative, because, as I've explained, the complexity of this model doesn't seem to be one the brain should be able to construct without some alternate sensory information source. But we do actually have some tantalizing evidence for this flow of information in the cortex. Some neuroscientists would disagree with my interpretation here, but then they come from the position that it's impossible for information to be flowing from some other place. So this was a paper published maybe 3 or 4 years ago now by the Imperial College Research, Psychedelic Research Group in London, that was led at the time by Robin Carhart Harris. And they looked at the way they used EEG to actually monitor the flow of information through the brain. So, maybe I should stand here, in profile. So, when sensory information enters your brain, it enters through the eyes, as we know, visual information, reaches the back of the cortex, and then flows upwards through that cortical hierarchy. So it's flowing in this direction, forwards. Yes, it's flowing forwards. It's not going in that direction. It starts here. Yes, it's flowing in this direction, it's flowing forwards. And you can actually monitor that flow of information by monitoring the cortical oscillations, these electrical waves, brain waves. And you can actually see this information flowing forwards. You also have, because you see these waves flowing forwards, there's also waves that flow in the opposite direction. This is kind of the model testing, the way the brain is testing its model. So you have this flow of information flowing in both directions. Now, when you've got your eyes open and you're viewing the world, information is flowing in from the senses. You get an increase. You can see an increase in these waves, these electrical waves flowing forwards over the cortex if you measure with EEG. Yeah, this isn't exactly clear, but I'll just explain what it shows. So here you have somebody who is being shown a visual stimulus. They have their eyes closed, they're not seeing anything, then they open their eyes, they start viewing the world, information starts flowing into the brain. And we start to see an increase in these forward traveling waves. You can see it forward in blue. Backward traveling waves go down, and these forward traveling waves, they increase. So you can literally see the flow of information, the flow of these waves increase in the forward direction. Yes, up the cortical hierarchy. Amazingly, when you inject someone with DMT, you see the same effect. You inject them with DMT, their eyes are closed, they're not seeing, they're not receiving sensory information apparently, but what happens? Forward traveling waves increase, just as if they were viewing a world. And in fact, they say eyes closed DMT is associated with striking changes in cortical dynamics, which are remarkably similar to those observed during actual eyes open visual stimulation. Specifically, we observe a reduction in backward waves and an increase in forward waves.
Has this been seen with other psychedelics as well?
No.
Damn.
Not that I'm aware of. Whether it's been done with other psychedelics, I don't know. Now, they would say, of course, oh, this is just spontaneous activity in the, it's just spontaneous activity in the visual cortex that's flowing. I would say, maybe not. Maybe not. It looks like, indeed, you are viewing. It's almost identical to the state, the eyes open state. You're as if you're viewing another world. Yes?
Has this been replicated in sight-impaired individuals?
No, it hasn't. But these are really, people often ask, the question I get all the time is, what does a blind person see? Someone who's congenitally blind, blind from birth. What happens when they're given DMT? The problem, of course, is that they don't know what it's like to see. They don't know what visual experience is like. So you can't say, oh, did you see any colors? I don't know what fucking color is. So it's kind of, that's the problem, part of it. But they do describe experiences that are unlike anything they've ever experienced. But is that did they have a visual experience? Did they see something? That's that problem of other minds. We can't get into that. Yes.
My question is, if you're taking like serotonin reuptake prohibitors, other substance, how does that affect the experience of all this? Or does that person who has been trauma-based, haven't taken anti-anxiety, depression medication, or maybe psychotic, would not be a good candidate to do DMT?
Right, so this is a good question, and it comes up a lot, is if you're on, particularly, as you said, the SSRIs, these selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, does it affect the DMT experience? It's not dangerous. Many people, I can't offer medical advice, I can't encourage you to do DMT, of course, but from reports, there are many people who are on these medications and use DMT and other psychedelics without issues. What's generally found is that it's you need a higher dosage. It's more difficult. It actually does affect, because these psychotherapeutic drugs, they do affect, over time, they change the way that these receptors are expressed in the brain. They alter the expression of these receptors. And it does seem to cause kind of reduction in your ability to kind of experience the effect. But, and again, I can't advise you here, but I know that many people do who are on certain drugs, particularly normally things like fluoxetine or other SSRIs do use psychedelics without issue. But this is entirely your responsibility, so to speak. Yes?
I just had a question on the, like, what fires the different columns. Is that Is there decision-making in that
Yes.
somewhere?
Yes, so if you think about each column is built from all these neurons which are generating information, speaking to each other. They're computing. Each column is like a small computer. So it receives information from other columns and it makes a decision. It processes that information and then either it will remain quiet, off, or it will switch on.
So is that related to consciousness?
Oh, good question, but we don't know. We don't know. That's why I don't talk about consciousness, because it is a slippery subject. Okay, so that was kind of a teaser that maybe there is some evidence that there is a flow of information, that we can even measure it in the brain. So, bearing in mind everything that I've said, I've spoken about information being generated that generates your world model, why it's information, how everything emerges from this ground of reality, this fundamental informational structure at the ground of it all, upwards, this hierarchy of complexity, and your world emerges at the top of this hierarchy. And that psychedelics make the brain more susceptible to information-driven reorganization. They create this flexible hot state, and I explained, why this hot state is generated, because these neurons are made more excitable, the columns become more excitable, they can communicate more freely with each other, which means that the cortex overall becomes much more susceptible to being reorganized by some alternate source of sensory information. Again, you don't break through into the DMT world breaks through into you. It's the flow of information from this other place into your brain, which causes your brain to construct this alternate world model. So finally, let's think then, where does this information come from? Well, we have a much broader, more complete picture of reality now. We're not just focusing on visual information coming in at the neuronal level through the senses. We've seen we can bring in information. Information can pass into this flow of information, this up and down flow at many different levels, and still be ultimately incorporated into the world model. So it doesn't have to be right there. So we shouldn't expect to kind of be able to detect normally this source of alternate information, because it might not be, or it doesn't seem to be entering this hierarchy, this information flow at the neuronal level. It seems to be entering, or is more likely, in my opinion, to be entering at one of these lower levels. So this is our complete image of this cortical, of this organizational hierarchy, the brain, the cortex, building your world model, the flow of information up and down, always flow of information up and down. Psychedelics stimulate at the molecular level, binding to receptors. Information flows up into the brain, affects the emerging world model in the way that we described. But this information flows in both directions all the time. It doesn't stop at any particular level. Information is always flowing in both directions, all the way from the ground of reality itself, all the way up to your cortical world model. So anywhere, at any level where you introduce information, that will have an effect at this highest level. So it makes most sense to me that the interaction between other and your world model is occurring at a very, very low level. Perhaps at the level of base reality itself, where that relationship, whatever it is, between our universe and that other place is instantiated.
I have a question for you.
Yes.
If someone is a schizophrenic,
Yes.
how would that fit into this pattern?
Well, so it's a complex question with a complex answer, and schizophrenia is something that's been studied for many decades, and there is there remain a number of different models of what's going on with schizophrenia, but perhaps schizophrenia is generally thought to be an issue with, it's a connection disorder. It's a disorder of the connectivity in the brain, in the simplest possible terms, right? And that, of course, determines the connectivity, as we've seen, it determines the structure of your world model, your model of reality. And if you change that connectivity, if there's a disorder that affects the proper development of that connectivity, then your experience of reality and your relationship to the environment, your relationship to yourself, your relationship to other people can change quite dramatically. And that takes the form, in this particular condition, the symptoms of schizophrenia.
It seems like that's pretty similar to what's going on here.
Yes, but in a different kind of way. And in fact, I mean, going back several decades now, psychedelics used to be called psychotomimetics. But really the psychotic state and the psychedelic state are not the same. In many, they're the same in that they are a different type of world and self-model that's being constructed. That's true. But it doesn't mean that they're the same at all. So psychedelics are not psychotomimetics, in my opinion. They don't generate psychosis. They're not really particularly good models of psychosis. But they are altered world models. Okay, I'm going to keep going. Not much time left. Okay, so this is, as I said, other is interacting, I believe, at a much lower level. The flow of information is happening at a much lower level than normal sensory information, but it still is affecting, it's still flowing upwards and affecting the construction of the world model. So we saw before that the consensus world is a different world model to this alien world, this DMT world, different patterns of cortical column activation, different patterns of activity. And when you smoke DMT, what seems to occur is in the breakthrough state, you get this, what I refer to as a hyperstructured state. It's highly structured, even more structured and more complex than the normal waking world. People always describe this incredibly rich symmetry and geometry of this space. It's a highly structured, highly information-rich state. So when DMT enters the brain, so of course DMT itself is interacting at the receptor level, just like any other psychedelic, it causes this reorganization of the world-based landscape and generates this highly structured pattern of information. This is the kind of the pre-breakthrough phase as the world model is reorganizing. And of course, this information is generated at the highest level, but it flows in at the receptor level upwards. And of course, information is always flowing in both directions. So we have this activation phase, I call it, where the brain begins generating this hyperstructured information. Then we enter what appears to be some kind of gating phase. So that information, of course, is also flowing downwards. We get this upwards and downwards flow of information. It doesn't stop here, all the way down. And it's my belief that this gating is occurring. There is some mechanism by which the flow of information right down to the base of reality causes this gating mechanism, some kind of switch mechanism that allows that interaction between our universe and this other place to take place. We don't understand this gating. Just 1 second, I'm almost finished. So this gating takes place at the ground, at base reality, maybe, or certainly at a very, very low level. And of course, then the information can begin to flow from this lowest level, and again, information flows upwards, and this is the information that allows your brain to construct this alternate model of this environment. Then, as the DMT leaves the brain. So this is kind of what the DMT, those who haven't experienced it, this is what DMT kind of feels like. It takes control. Yes, the information begins flowing upwards through this hierarchy of complexity, and it takes control of your world-building machinery. Then, as DMT leaves the brain, its effect on the receptors, of course, diminishes, and you get this release phase where the cortical activity falls back, the world-space landscape collapses back into its original geometry, and you lose that hyperstructured information at the highest level, and the gating mechanism closes, and you find yourself back in the normal waking world, receiving sensory information in the normal way. So this kind of summarizes everything that we have talked about today. In the normal waking state, the world is modulated by information from the environment in a normal way. In the DMT state, this restructured world model gates the flow of information from other, wherever other might be. And I would think that is plenty for today. So thank you very much for listening. So it's 10:30. I will answer questions as I'm packing. I have to be out of the door at 10:45 to go to the airport, so do your worst in that time.
You left me hanging right at the end. So you have this as the DMT is leaving the brain, and we revert back to our routine world model.
Yeah.
How can there be no neurogenesis at that point, no plasticity that changes both sides?
Well, again, as I spoke about, were you in my talk yesterday? No? My workshop.
Something happened. There was an interruption. It was never answered.
All right. Yeah. So because this cortical remodeling takes a long time to develop, so it's not going to happen significantly, although we can't really be sure of that, with a normal kind of 5-minute DMT trip. But over time, as I said yesterday, if with longer and longer infusions, weeks or something, this remodeling will take place. And then when the DMT leaves, you don't get that snapback.
That's the technology you're working on now.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm working on it. It was just kind of wishing.
Doctor, a quick question, if I may. Thank you so much for that beautiful snapshot of the new reality, the new worldview. Could I ask, without sounding flippant, the political question, so what?
Well, Well, I mean, what I've always said is that most people don't take DMT seriously. So my job, I think, is to convince people that we should take DMT seriously. And take seriously the idea that we are indeed interacting with some other intelligence. And as I said in the panel yesterday, that would be a shattering discovery, and the discovery of some advanced alien intelligence with whom we can communicate with great facility and great ease. That would be the most remarkable discovery in the history of humankind, by far, I would think. So I look to that stage where people are really taking this seriously, and then where do we go from there? What kind of, do we, establishing relationships with these intelligences, just recognizing, first of all, that we're not cock of the walk, so to speak, and that there are other intelligences more advanced than us. We are part of some larger structure. That in itself my job would be done if people started to accept that.
I figured out a way to prove it.
Oh, God.
The secret word, tell the entity that word, and have that entity tell your friend.
Yeah, so,
If you do that, you prove the whole thing.
well, then the parapsychologists will come along and say, oh, it was just telepathy. You can't win. So I don't know which Occam, I don't know where Occam's razor slices that.
Most people don't believe it's telepathy. Send information, possibly, that would prove their own.
Yeah, Paul, you said you carry around a 5-digit number in your wallet. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. Do you know what the number is?
Yes.
Okay, so what you should do is have the number generated so you don't know it, and then ask the entities what the number is. Otherwise, so you're not getting it directly from yourself. You know what I mean? So that's another way of doing it. So no one, it's not telepathy, then they would say, oh, it's clairvoyance, or you can't win with these parapsychologists. Well, Sonoran, that's not DMT, first of all. That's 5-methoxy-DMT. It's a completely different molecule, completely different effect. So you shouldn't get those mixed up, or you'll have a hell of a time. Yes, it's more potent in that you need less of it, just a few milligrams compared to 30 or 40 milligrams, and the experience is very non-visual, ego-destroying, shattering. So yeah, they're completely different experiences, not to be mixed up. Yes.